Good evening. Within a few hours, Hurricane Milton is expected to make landfall on the west coast of Florida, the western coast of Florida.
The devastating arrival of Hurricane Milton on Florida's shores has left many wondering whether the federal response, led by President Joe Biden, came too late to prevent further catastrophe. Dubbed the Hurricane of the Century, Milton has ravaged Florida's western coastline, leaving behind destruction on an unprecedented scale. With millions of residents in the storm's path, evacuation efforts were crucial. Yet the administration's response has sparked criticism for its timing and effectiveness. As the storm approached, many Floridians scrambled to evacuate, but some argue that President Biden's warnings and federal actions didn't come soon enough. Although Biden did issue a warning ahead of the hurricane and directed federal agencies like FEMA to coordinate resources.
In less than 14 hours, Hurricane Milton will make landfall on the western coast of Florida.
The timing has been called into question, particularly by local officials and residents who felt blindsided by the magnitude of the storm's impact. Hurricane Milton will be remembered as one of the most destructive and unpredictable storms in modern history, ravaging Florida with unprecedented force. Initially categorized as a Category 4 hurricane, Milton rapidly intensified in the days leading up to landfall, catching many Floridians off guard. Sustained winds of over 150 miles per hour pummeled the Gulf Coast, accompanied by torrential rain and devastating storm surges that submerged entire communities. The destruction extended far beyond initial projections, with entire towns left unrecognizable as floodwaters surged inland, and coastal areas were battered by relentless winds. Meteorologists had warned of the potential for rapid intensification, but few could have predicted the sheer magnitude of the storm. By the time Hurricane Milton made landfall, Florida's western coast was already reeling from the extreme weather conditions. Towns from Tampa Bay to Fort Myers saw catastrophic damage, with homes reduced to rubble, infrastructure crippled, and power outages affecting millions. Early predictions had shown uncertainty about the storm's path, making it difficult to coordinate large-scale evacuations until it was too late for many. Florida is no stranger to hurricanes, yet Milton proved to be an exceptional storm in both its intensity and unpredictability. Its path shifted dramatically in the final hours before landfall, leaving many residents with little time to evacuate. Despite efforts by local emergency response teams, including pre-positioning of supplies and personnel, the speed at which the storm intensified overwhelmed state and federal resources. Evacuation routes became gridlocked, shelters overflowed, and many residents were forced to shelter in place as the storm bore down. As the hurricane approached, President Biden and FEMA officials urged Floridians to evacuate, but many felt these warnings came too late. Although Biden declared a state of emergency, activating FEMA and other federal agencies to provide aid, there were widespread criticisms about the timing of the response. Some residents and local officials argued that earlier federal involvement could have facilitated a more organized evacuation effort. The devastation caused by Hurricane Milton has prompted serious questions about the preparedness of both local and federal authorities. While Florida's emergency response agencies were mobilized, the chaos that ensued during evacuations, overcrowded highways, limited access to shelters, and insufficient communication has led to renewed scrutiny of the state's disaster management strategies. Critics argue that a quicker federal response could have saved lives, minimized property damage, and prevented the logistical nightmares that unfolded across the state. Hurricane Milton's aftermath has left Florida with a long road to recovery. With millions of homes without power, vast areas flooded, and thousands displaced, the disaster's full impact is still being assessed. The federal government, through FEMA, has committed to extensive recovery efforts, but the criticism surrounding the initial response will likely linger for months to come as Florida grapples with the consequences of this historic storm. In the days leading up to Hurricane Milton, Florida's state and local governments scrambled to prepare for what would become one of the most destructive storms in the state's history. Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency ahead of the hurricane, mobilizing the Florida National Guard.
This is probably the largest National Guard mobilization in advance of a storm in Florida history.
Activating evacuation orders and setting up emergency shelters. Emergency services across the state worked to pre-position resources, including medical supplies, rescue equipment, and personnel in key areas expected to be hit hardest. However, despite these efforts, the sheer magnitude and speed of Hurricane Milton posed overwhelming challenges. Local officials had limited time to evacuate millions of residents due to the hurricane's rapid intensification, leading to chaotic evacuations on major highways. Traffic gridlocks extended for miles, leaving many unable to evacuate in time. Moreover, shelters quickly filled to capacity, with many residents struggling to find a safe place to ride out the storm. One of the significant challenges local officials faced was the coordination of disaster management efforts with federal agencies like FEMA. Although FEMA was eventually deployed, critics argue that earlier federal involvement could have eased some of the burdens on local emergency services, particularly regarding evacuation logistics. Many residents were left without proper guidance on whether to stay or leave, leading to confusion and panic as the storm closed in. Rescue teams braved flooded streets and treacherous conditions to help stranded residents, while emergency medical services worked tirelessly to provide care to those injured during the storm. However, the overall response highlighted the need for better coordination and faster mobilization of both state and federal resources during major disasters like Hurricane Milton. As Hurricane Milton ravaged Florida, President Joe Biden found himself at the center of criticism for what many see as a delayed federal response. Despite early meteorological warnings about the storm's potential for destruction, the Biden administration has been accused of waiting too long to implement aggressive evacuation efforts. While the president did eventually declare a state of emergency and activate FEMA to coordinate resources,
We have 20 million meals, 40 million liters of water.
critics argue that by then, much of the damage had already been done. The perceived lateness of the federal response has left many Floridians asking whether more lives and property could have been saved with a swifter and more decisive government intervention. By the time Hurricane Milton was approaching Florida's coastline, evacuation orders had already been issued by state authorities. But the ferocity and speed of the storm took many by surprise. The hurricane intensified rapidly, leaving residents with little time to react. Congested highways, overcrowded shelters, and late-stage evacuation orders compounded the chaos as people struggled to escape the storm's path. While FEMA began deploying resources and federal officials offered assistance, the disjointed response between state and federal governments raised questions about whether earlier coordination could have prevented some of the worst impacts. This isn't the first time Biden's administration has faced such critiques. The handling of Hurricane Ian in 2022 drew similar complaints of delayed federal action, with state officials voicing frustration over the slow arrival of FEMA aid. The comparisons don't stop there. Parallels have also been drawn to the response during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, under George W. Bush's administration, where a delayed federal response was similarly blamed for exacerbating the disaster. While Biden's actions haven't reached the level of fallout experienced by Bush post-Katrina, the narrative of a reactive rather than proactive approach persists. The response to Hurricane Milton has also been politicized. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a prominent Republican and potential 2028 presidential contender, has been quick to highlight what he sees as the failures of the Biden administration.
The state of Florida received notification that the Biden administration denied Florida's request for individual assistance.
DeSantis and other Republican leaders have argued that the federal government was too slow to allocate resources, leaving state agencies to carry much of the burden. This critique aligns with long-standing conservative complaints about federal overreach and inefficiency during disaster responses. The media's coverage of the hurricane has intensified the criticism. Images of flooded streets, homes destroyed, and residents stranded without immediate federal aid have fueled public outcry. As a result, the perception of Biden's leadership during this crisis is at risk, particularly among residents in Florida, a key swing state. Many survivors are now calling into question the timeliness and effectiveness of the evacuation efforts and disaster relief provided by the federal government. In disaster situations, time is critical, and the federal government's ability to respond swiftly can make the difference between life and death. While natural disasters are inherently unpredictable, the expectation is that the federal government must be prepared to act immediately. Hurricane Milton has once again put Biden's crisis management skills under scrutiny, reminding many of his past struggles to mount timely responses to emergencies. President Biden's response to Hurricane Milton is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of perceived shortcomings in managing crises throughout his political career. While natural disasters and emergencies are often unpredictable, unpredictable, the speed and efficiency of the federal government's response are crucial in minimizing loss and damage. Unfortunately for Biden, his administration has repeatedly faced accusations of delayed action and mismanagement, leading to widespread frustration and disappointment. One of the most significant crises of Biden's presidency came in August 2021 with the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Biden had inherited a deal from the Trump administration to end the 20-year war, but the speed at which the Taliban retook control of the country shocked many, including U.S. military officials. Images of frantic evacuations, with desperate Afghans clinging to airplanes at Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport, were broadcast worldwide, leading to intense criticism of Biden's handling of the situation. The Biden administration was criticized for a lack of foresight, particularly regarding the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and military. Despite intelligence reports warning of a swift Taliban resurgence, the withdrawal process appeared disorganized, leaving thousands of U.S. citizens and Afghan allies at risk. The tragic bombing near the Kabul airport that killed 13 U.S. service members further fueled criticism, with many accusing the administration of underestimating the risks and failing to implement a more coordinated and secure withdrawal. When Biden took office in January 2021, the U.S. was deep in the grips of the COVID-19 pandemic. Though Biden swiftly ramped up the vaccine rollout, which had begun under the previous administration, his response to the evolving crisis was not without its missteps. The administration was often criticized for inconsistent messaging, particularly concerning mask mandates and booster shots. Public confusion over shifting guidance from the CDC eroded trust in the government's handling of the pandemic, with critics arguing that the administration failed to communicate clear, consistent plans. In the summer of 2021, the Delta variant caused a sharp increase in cases, prompting new restrictions and a renewed push for vaccinations. However, by late 2021 and early 2022, the Omicron variant further tested Biden's response. Although vaccines were widely available, the administration struggled to contain the surge in cases, and testing shortages during the holiday season exacerbated the public's frustration. Critics argued that the administration failed to anticipate the scale of the Omicron wave and did not prepare adequately for the renewed demand for testing and healthcare resources. Natural disasters have consistently tested Biden's administration, particularly regarding the speed and adequacy of federal responses. In August 2021, Hurricane Ida struck the Gulf Coast, causing widespread devastation from Louisiana to the northeastern U.S. While FEMA and other federal agencies eventually provided significant resources for recovery, there were complaints from local officials about the slow arrival of federal aid in some of the hardest-hit areas. The lengthy power outages in New Orleans and the inundation of New York City with floodwaters revealed the weaknesses in infrastructure, but also in disaster preparedness at both the federal and local levels. Biden's response to Ida was more measured compared to his handling of Hurricane Milton, but the criticisms were similar, too reactive rather than proactive. While declarations of emergency were issued in a timely manner, on-the-ground aid often felt delayed or inadequate to the scale of the disaster. The lessons learned from Ida have seemingly not carried over to Milton, where Biden again faced backlash for not moving quickly enough to help mitigate the human and economic costs of the storm. Just a year after Ida, Hurricane Ian slammed into Florida in September 2022, bringing back similar complaints about the federal government's response. Ian left a trail of destruction, particularly in southwestern Florida, and while Biden once again issued a disaster declaration and coordinated with FEMA, state and local officials were left scrambling to manage evacuations and resources. The federal response was criticized for not being swift enough, and some accused the Biden administration of underestimating the storm's potential. These incidents point to a recurring pattern in Biden's approach to crisis management: delayed or insufficient action in the face of rapidly evolving situations, whether it's international conflicts, public health emergencies, or natural disasters. The administration's responses have frequently been reactive rather than preemptive. This pattern is now being echoed with Hurricane Milton, where the federal government's perceived delay in ordering evacuations and mobilizing resources has once again come under fire. President Joe Biden's political career, spanning more than 5 decades, has not been without its share of controversies and scandals. While his longevity in politics speaks to his resilience and ability to adapt, it also means he has faced numerous challenges to his credibility and leadership, many of which have followed him into his presidency. From early controversies in his Senate days to more recent issues involving his family, these scandals have been used by his critics to question his fitness for leadership. One of the earliest and most notable controversies in Biden's career occurred during his first run for the presidency in 1987. Biden's campaign was gaining momentum when it was revealed that he had plagiarized parts of a speech from British Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock. The scandal quickly grew when further instances of plagiarism were uncovered in his law school records. Biden was accused of copying large portions of work without proper attribution, which forced him to withdraw from the race. Though Biden eventually recovered from this scandal and continued his political career, the incident left a lasting stain on his reputation, one that opponents have resurfaced during subsequent elections. This controversy laid the groundwork for questions about Biden's honesty and attention to detail, criticisms that have persisted throughout his career. As a senator from Delaware, Biden played a pivotal role in crafting the 1994 crime bill, formerly known as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. While the bill was initially lauded for its tough stance on crime and its provisions for increasing law enforcement resources, it has since become highly controversial, especially in discussions about racial justice and the criminal justice system. Critics argue that the bill contributed to mass incarceration, disproportionately affecting African American communities by imposing harsher penalties for non-violent drug offenses. Biden has faced criticism for his role in pushing this legislation, particularly from progressives and racial justice advocates. During his 2020 presidential campaign, the bill became a frequent talking point for opponents, who used it to challenge his record on race and criminal justice reform. Biden has since admitted that aspects of the bill were a mistake, but the controversy remains a significant part of his legislative legacy. In more recent years, the spotlight has shifted to Biden's son, Hunter Biden, whose business dealings in Ukraine and China have been the subject of numerous investigations and widespread media attention. The controversy first gained traction during the 2020 presidential election when it was revealed that Hunter Biden had served on the board of Burisma, a Ukrainian energy company, while his father was vice president. Republican opponents have accused Joe Biden of using his influence as vice president to protect his son's business interests in Ukraine, although no evidence of direct wrongdoing by Biden has been found. Despite this, the Hunter Biden scandal has been a persistent issue for Biden's presidency, particularly among conservative critics who argue that the incident raises serious questions about corruption and ethics. Further complicating matters, the release of Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020, which contained emails and other materials related to his overseas business dealings, intensified the scrutiny. The controversy has continued to fester throughout Biden's presidency, with ongoing investigations into Hunter Biden's taxes and business practices adding to the administration's challenges. Although Joe Biden has denied any involvement in his son's business dealings, the ongoing media coverage has provided political ammunition for his opponents. Another controversy that has plagued Biden's administration is the handling of the southern U.S. border and the growing immigration crisis. During his campaign, Biden promised a more humane approach to immigration compared to his predecessor, Donald Trump. However, the rapid increase in migrants at the border in early 2021 led to overcrowded detention facilities and reports of poor conditions, sparking intense criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. Republicans argue that Biden's policies encouraged more migrants to attempt to enter the U.S., while progressives have criticized his administration for continuing to use some of the same enforcement tactics that were in place during the Trump administration. The situation at the border remains a highly contentious issue, with Biden struggling to strike a balance between maintaining border security and upholding humanitarian values. Throughout his career, Biden has faced several allegations of inappropriate behavior, primarily related to his interactions with women. In 2019, multiple women came forward accusing Biden of touching them in ways that made them feel uncomfortable.
He reached over and put his hands behind my head and pulled me close, and I thought, he's going to kiss me.
While none of the allegations were sexual in nature, the accusations painted a picture of a politician who was out of touch with modern boundaries regarding personal space. Biden publicly addressed the allegations, promising to be more mindful of people's personal space in the future. Despite this, the accusations have continued to surface, and his opponents frequently raise them as a way to question his character and ability to adapt to changing social norms. The aftermath of Hurricane Milton has done more than devastate Florida's infrastructure and communities. It has also triggered a wave of political consequences for President Joe Biden. With mounting criticism over his handling of the evacuation and disaster response, the hurricane has provided an opportunity for Biden's political opponents to amplify their attacks on his leadership and crisis management capabilities. The fallout from Milton, unsurprisingly, Republicans have been quick to seize on the perceived delays in the federal response to Hurricane Milton. Many GOP leaders, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, have publicly criticized the Biden administration for failing to act swiftly enough. The delayed evacuation orders, coupled with reports of overwhelmed shelters and insufficient federal coordination, have provided political ammunition for those eager to challenge Biden's presidency. Governor DeSantis, in particular, has used the hurricane as an opportunity to position himself as a strong, decisive leader in contrast to Biden's perceived indecisiveness. DeSantis, who is widely seen as a potential 2028 presidential candidate, has focused on highlighting the failures of the federal response, while emphasizing the strength of Florida's state-level emergency preparedness efforts. This political dynamic has deepened the partisan divide, with DeSantis' supporters viewing the hurricane response as yet another example of federal overreach and inefficiency under Biden's leadership. Biden's response to Hurricane Milton has invited comparisons to other presidents who faced intense scrutiny for their disaster responses. George W. Bush's handling of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 is perhaps the most notable parallel, as his administration's delayed response to the catastrophe in New Orleans led to a significant drop in public support. Similarly, Biden's handling of Hurricane Milton may have long-term consequences for his approval ratings and political legacy. While Biden's situation may not be as dire as Bush's post-Katrina fallout, the slow response has still left many questioning his leadership. Natural disasters have a unique ability to sway public opinion as they impact citizens on a deeply personal level, and the perception of being let down by federal leadership can have lasting effects. In addition to direct political attacks, the media's coverage of the hurricane will play a critical role in shaping public perception. If the narrative continues to focus on the slow federal response, it could further damage Biden's reputation as a capable crisis manager. However, if recovery efforts in the coming weeks are successful and well coordinated, the administration may be able to mitigate some of the political damage. Public perception is often shaped not only by the immediate response to a crisis, but by the ongoing recovery process. If Biden can demonstrate effective leadership in the post-hurricane rebuilding phase, he may be able to recover some of the political capital lost during the storm's initial stages. The fallout from Hurricane Milton extends beyond the physical destruction left in its wake. It has triggered renewed scrutiny of President Joe Biden's crisis management capabilities. The slow federal response, coupled with the delayed evacuation efforts, has left many questioning whether more could have been done to prevent the worst outcomes. Critics point to a pattern of delayed action in Biden's handling of major crises, from the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan to natural disasters like Hurricane Ida and now Milton. Biden's past controversies and shortcomings have only compounded the public's perception of his administration's response to Hurricane Milton, whether it's the Hunter Biden scandal, his legislative history, or mishandled emergencies. These factors continue to play into the broader narrative of a president who struggles with swift decision-making in moments of crisis. Politically, the handling of Milton could have significant consequences for Biden's presidency and the upcoming 2024 elections. With Florida playing a key role in national politics, the state's residents and political leaders may not easily forget the perceived shortcomings in the federal response. As recovery efforts begin, Biden's ability to rally federal resources and demonstrate competent leadership will be critical in shaping his legacy and political future. Ultimately, Hurricane Milton has exposed weaknesses in the current administration's ability to manage fast-evolving situations. As the nation braces for the next challenge, whether it be another natural disaster, economic crisis, or international conflict, Biden's handling of Hurricane Milton will serve as a reminder of the critical importance of timely and decisive leadership in moments of national emergency.